Well, there's been a lot in the news in recent years about the brain and meditation. You may have read that meditation increases gamma wave activity, or you may have read that over time meditation can increase the amount of white matter in the brain. Well, I'm not sure which of these findings are going to hold up in the long run, and in some cases I'm not even really sure what they mean. But there is one finding that's easy to relate to meditative experience in a pretty straightforward way. You tell meditators about this finding and they say, yeah, it makes sense that my brain would be doing that while I'm meditating. And this finding has to do with a part of the brain called the default mode network. And the basic finding, as in this paper that was published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, is that when people meditate, the default mode network kind of gets quieter, it gets less and less active. And this leads to the question of what the default mode network is. And for the answer, we turn to the lead author of this paper, Judson Brewer, who when he did the study was at Yale Medical School and now is at the University of Massachusetts Medical School.
So it's called the default mode network because this seems to be active when we're not doing anything in particular. And if you think about any average person walking down the street not doing anything in particular, there's actually a whole lot going on in their brain. They're thinking about themselves usually. So they might be regretting something they did in the past, worrying about something that's coming up, planning for something, fantasizing. Lots of things that are happening in our brains when we're not doing anything in particular. And this network of brain regions seems to get activated or co-activated when we're doing these types of self-referential processing tasks.
So you might say that what the default mode network does is take your mind somewhere other than where you are. It does that in a spatial sense. In other words, you're probably not going to be focused on your immediate environment when the network is active. And it does so in a temporal sense, along the dimension of time as well. They've done studies where they interrupt people while their minds are wandering, and basically the default mode network is your mind wandering, and they ask them what they're thinking about. And usually they're thinking either about something in the past or something in the future, more the future than the past, but they're usually not thinking about the present. Now, it makes sense in that light that the default mode network would get quiet as you meditate, because after all, one way to phrase kind of one of the main points of meditation is be here now. That is the title of a famous book that was published in the 1970s about meditation and spirituality. Now, when you're meditating, you may notice that the default mode network does not always surrender quietly, right? You're trying to focus on the breath and suddenly a thought bubbles up. What about this email I've got to write later today? It's kind of delicate. How should I handle it? Or you'll think of someone you may have offended a couple of days ago, wonder how you can make amends, or you'll think about somebody you've got a crush on, how you can impress them when you see them in a couple of days, whatever. Those things are your default mode network asserting itself. And in a way, it's just doing its job. The job of the default mode network seems to be to take advantage of free time. So in other words, if you're not engaged in some task that requires focus, if you're not playing some sport or writing some report or just looking at somebody and wondering whether that's somebody you know, if you're not doing one of these things that requires conscious focus, then in a way that's free time. And what the default mode network does is try to use that time in some sense usefully, taking care of your business, your social business, your professional business, whatever. Now, when the default mode network does quiet down during meditation, that doesn't necessarily mean you've entered a state of mindfulness. The studies show that the network quiets down during various kinds of meditation, mindfulness meditation, but also concentration meditation, for example. Now, it certainly is an important first step toward mindfulness for the network to calm down, for you to kind of get beyond the kind of self-involvement that the network keeps you enmeshed in. But in order to reach a state of mindfulness, there's a second sense in which you have to escape self-involvement. Remember, to look at something mindfully is to look at it objectively, to look at it not from your ordinary subjective perspective. So a true test of mindfulness would be, say, to think of someone you don't like and see if you can just kind of look at the feeling of dislike and not get caught up in it, not let it carry your train of thought away so that you don't wind up rehearsing a litany of grievances against the person or plotting revenge against the person. Then you're closer to a state of mindfulness. It's a common aspiration to carry mindfulness out of the meditation hall into the real world, to carry this attitude of kind of non-reactivity into your ordinary life. One reason that's hard is because life is full of things you do react to. Psychologists have done studies where they show people pictures of various kinds of objects and things, and sometimes they ask them, how do you feel about this? And the people say, well, I like it, I don't like it, whatever. Sometimes the methodology is subtler. There's a more kind of circuitous way of figuring out whether people are having a positive or negative affective reaction to the thing, whether they are or are not feeling a favorable or an unfavorable feeling to it. And the general finding is that people do have affective reactions to a whole lot of things. In one study, they actually asked people to morally evaluate everyday objects, asked them if these things are good or bad in a moral sense, and people were pretty willing to do that. As Paul Bloom, who was one of the co-authors of that study, explained to me recently. Paul is a well-known professor of psychology at Yale, and here's what he said.
The paper is titled something like, "Is a refrigerator good or evil?" And so we just had a list of items. Now, some of the items were meant to have valence. They were like a thumb screw or a vaccine. What are you saying? A thumb screw, bad, vaccine, good. But we also, refrigerator, sock, cloud. And, people had no problem at all. We thought first that they'd find a question nonsensical. How good is it? How bad is it? They readily answered all of them. And there was considerable consensus.
Now, none of this is to say that most things in the world elicit a strong positive or negative affective reaction in us. In fact, you can look around at things in your environment now, and I'm sure you can look at plenty of things where you don't have any particular reaction, or you might say, I kind of like that, or that's mildly annoying, but it's far from overpowering. However, it is the case that the things that occupy our awareness do tend to be things that we feel positively or negatively about in a somewhat strong way. So if you're walking down the street and you see an enemy, or you see a friend, somebody you feel bad about or good about, or you smell some horrible odor or some sublime smell from a restaurant, that will get your attention. That will be what you focus on. And this makes sense when you think about it, because the brain is designed to get us to focus on things that matter to us. And the way the brain encodes the extent to which things matter to us is to assign them a positive or negative feeling. And the more they matter, the stronger the feeling. So it just makes sense that your awareness would tend to be occupied by these kind of meaningful things, things that do elicit a strong reaction. And it also makes sense that the default mode network would tend to inject these things into your consciousness that also you feel somewhat strongly about. They matter to you for good or for bad. And this points to the basic challenge of mindfulness. The idea of mindfulness is to take an objective attitude, in some sense a detached attitude, toward the things you're paying attention to, and yet your brain is designed to pay attention to those things it is hardest to be objective and detached about. So here's an experiment you might try when you're walking down the street. Try to pay attention to things you don't normally pay attention to. Now, what those things are will depend on what demographic you're in. So suppose you are a young heterosexual male. Then you're probably in the habit of paying attention to young females, and especially if you find them attractive or intriguing, paying even more attention to them. And you probably pay some attention to young males. Kind of size them up, compare them to yourself. Maybe they are, after all, in some sense, the competition. Well, try paying attention to like elderly people. One thing you'll find is it's hard, it's not natural to pay attention to these people because you don't care that much about them. But you may also find, if you do pay attention to them, it's easier to appraise them calmly. You're less involved, you have less at stake, and for that reason, you may look at them more objectively. My brother, when he reached an age where he felt that women were no longer paying attention to him, said, it's not that they think I'm unattractive, they just don't realize I exist. And that's kind of true. Our unconscious mind, I think, often excludes from our awareness the things that we're just not that interested. So all of this explains why it really is hard and in some sense unnatural to just walk down the street with a truly mindful attitude toward everything we're paying attention to. And this subject came up in my conversation with Paul Bloom. What we've kind of said is that everything you notice, you have an affective reaction to, and that makes sense in the sense that if it is not relevant to your Darwinian prospects for good or bad, there's no reason to notice it in the first place.
That's right. That's right. I mean, stripping the affective reactions away from our perception seems so profoundly anti-Darwinian. And I know you made this point before, but it seems like the strongest way to give the middle finger to our selfish genes, which is, we're going to take away this sort of everything. And for normally, the whole world is colored by whether it's good for us or bad for us, and to try to live without that seems interesting.
That is, I think, what kind of hardcore Buddhism aspires to do. I would just add a couple of asterisks to that. First of all, when I associated a Buddhist perspective with the things that Paul had said, I didn't mean to say that everything he had said was phrased exactly in a technical sense the way a Buddhist scholar would phrase it. So, for example, when he talked about stripping perception of affective reaction, you might say it's actually more like training your perception on the affective reaction, and in that way sometimes kind of depriving the reaction of its power. And for that matter, more broadly, I want to emphasize that whenever I speak of detachment or getting a critical distance from a feeling, that terminology can be misleading, because there's a sense that when you're observing something mindfully, like a feeling, you're actually getting quite close to it, closer than usual. Because ordinarily, our reaction to a kind of negative feeling like anxiety or fear is to want to push it away, to want to think of something or do something that will rid us of it. And to view it mindfully is kind of to be unafraid of it, to be willing to just get up close to it and look at it. And then sometimes it will tend to lose its power. So in that sense, talking about distance from, detachment from can be misleading, and for that reason some people prefer terms like non-attachment to terms like detachment. The final thing I would say about that exchange with Paul is that when I refer to a hardcore Buddhism, I don't mean to suggest that there's anything harsh in the mindful sensibility, and I also certainly don't mean to suggest ever that there's no pleasure to be found in it. And in fact, you see this sometimes on meditation retreats. A lot of people on retreats report how much pleasure there is to be found, which is interesting because a meditation retreat is a place where it's relatively easy to get into a kind of mindful frame of mind. And one reason is just because that, a lot of the stuff that annoys you in life is not there. You're not getting emails, some of which may agitate you. You're generally off the grid. You're not hearing any news about the world. So it's easier to sink into a mindful point of view. And people who've been to retreats can tell you about things like mindful eating. When I first went to a meditation retreat, I went into the dining hall. I couldn't understand, why do so many people have their eyes closed while they eat? Well, before long I got the picture, which is that if you close your eyes and focus on that moment of eating, you're not looking ahead to the next bite you're going to take, you're not being distracted by the default mode network, which is pretty quiet, and you're not having a conversation because these are silent meditation retreats. Nobody's talking. If you do that, you can find a pleasure in one moment of eating that is pretty much unprecedented in my experience. Similarly, people on meditation retreats often report, and I can vouch for this, that your appreciation of beauty can reach a new level, including the beauty of things that normally you might not even notice, like the pattern of grain in wood, which, if your default mode network were bubbling along, you just might not even see. So we're going to close by revisiting our friend Yifa, the Buddhist nun, as she describes what it's like to meditate, because her description sounds to me very much like what you would expect it to feel like for the default mode network to start to quiet down.
When you meditate, it's just like the water, in the water, you let the dust settle down. So water become very clean and also very peaceful, or even still. So if the water still, the surface like a mirror, and you will reflect the surrounding as things they are. So meditation is to help us to see things as they really are.
Speaking of Yifa, in the final segment of this lecture, we're going to get back to a question that she originally raised earlier when she said that during meditation, she gets this sense that her feelings are not real. I promised I'd get back to that question, and that's what we'll do now. We're going to ask, what does it mean for feelings to be real or not real, to be true or false? How can we tell when our feelings are trustworthy and when they're not?